안녕하세요. 네, 제 3회 KHIDI-KASBP 조인트 워크숍을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 저는 어제에 이어서 오늘 다시 한번 인사드리는 아나운서 조주연입니다. 반갑습니다. 네, 고맙습니다. 오늘 온라인과 오프라인으로 다시 한번 참석해 주시는 모든 분들께 진심으로 감사드리면서 2일차 행사를 다시 시작해 보도록 하겠습니다. 이번 행사는 제약기업들이 글로벌 선진 시장에 필요한 실질적인 정보를 공유하고 또 함께 전략을 논의할 수 있는 장으로서 한국 보건산업진흥원과 재미한인제약인협회 KHIDI-KASBP가 공동으로 기획을 한 행사입니다. 그리고 미국 FDA의 IND 및 NDA 신청에 대한 이해와 전략이라는 주제로 3일 동안 진행이 되고 있으며 어제가 1일차 그리고 내일 3일차까지 진행이 되겠습니다. 미국 현지의 전문가분들을 모시고 IND와 NDA 신청에 대해서 한국 기업들이 직면할 수 있는 각종 애로사항이나 해결 성공 전략 등을 분야별 그리고 단계별로 함께 공유할 수 있는 자리로 마련했습니다. 그리고 내일 같은 경우에는 마지막 날로서 1대1 온라인 비즈니스 미팅 프로그램을 운영을 하고 있습니다. 참석하고자 하시는 분들께서는 온라인을 통해서 신청을 해주시면 대단히 감사하겠습니다. 네, 그리고 발표 중에서 혹시 질문이 있으신 경우에는 채팅창에 바로바로 올려주시고요. 저희가 Q&A 시간에 연사분께 전달을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 저희가 어제도 굉장히 많은 질문들을 올려주셨는데 혹시라도 발표 연사분께 전달을 드리지 못했거나 시간 관계상 넘어간 이후에는 내일 또 신청을 하셔서 1대1 온라인 비즈니스 미팅 때 더 심도 있는 답변을 들어보시면 어떨까 싶습니다. 다시 한번 말씀드리지만 내일 1대1 온라인 비즈니스 미팅 프로그램은 신청을 해주시면 되겠습니다. 자, 그럼 저희 바로 첫 번째 연사분을 모셔보도록 하겠습니다. 이번 발표 연사분께서는 미국의 Recordati Rare Diseases의 Vice President로 계시는 분이죠. Regulatory Affairs and Chief Compliance Officer를 담당하고 계시는 Doctor of Pharmacy 샌디 서 박사님을 모시도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 발표해 주실 주제는 US FDA Overview, Pre-Submission, IND Content and Format, NDA, BLA Submission, and Industry and Reviewer Perspectives라는 주제로 좀 더 심도 있는 발표해 주시겠습니다. 발표 중에 계속해서 질문을 올려주시면 저희가 발표가 끝난 이후 질의응답 시간에 전달을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 지금 샌디 서 박사님께서는 미국 현지에서 접속 중이신데요. 혹시라도 연결이 매끄럽지 못할 경우 미리 양해의 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다. 자, 그럼 박사님을 모셔보도록 하겠습니다. 박사님 준비되셨나요?
Yes.
네, 그럼 발표 부탁드리겠습니다.
Please start your presentation.
Sure. So good morning, everybody. My name is Sandy Suh, and I'll be covering regulatory affairs for you this morning. I do apologize. I understand that the slides that you may have received will be a little bit different than what I'm presenting today. The content is the exact same. My intent was to help the flow a little bit, so I've rearranged some slides. But again, the content is the same, and if you have any questions, I'll take them whenever you provide them or at the end. I'm also going to try my very best to speak at a slower pace than my usual cadence because I do understand that this is being translated real time, and so to help the translators and to help you better understand, I hope to speak much slower than my usual pace to help with that. So let's get started. So today I wanted to cover with you just a very brief overview of the structure of FDA, specifically as it relates to the review of your application. It's highly likely that you will be in either CDER, CBER, or CDRH. Then I'll cover the pre-IND meeting, which will help you prepare yourself for the actual IND submission. And then I'll cover what happens when the IND goes in, and what happens if it has any kind of hold or something that will preclude you from starting your IND, as well as once your IND goes into effect, what you need to do to continue to support your IND. There's a few additional, what I'll call special programs or designations that may be of interest to you. So very high level overview of breakthrough, fast track, and accelerated designations. And then at that point, when your development program has progressed to a certain level and you're ready to package your NDA or BLA, before you go into the FDA again, you'll have a pre-submission meeting. It's a pre-NDA meeting. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll do an overview of what your NDA or BLA is going to look like. And then what happens to that application when it gets to the FDA. So this is the intent of what I'd like to cover for you. This should take us about an hour and 10 minutes or so. And then I'm hoping to save about 45 minutes or so for questions and answers, of course. So moving on. So this is the organizational structure of the Food and Drug Administration. And it's led by the Office of Commissioner, which is Janet Woodcock right now. And the first three boxes on the left-hand side, you're going to see the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. That is what we call CBER. So anything in the biologics world will fall into this area of FDA. And currently it's the director is Peter Marks. And this particular org chart, I've taken it from the internet, which you too can Google at fda.gov. And this is from April 2021. And so you just want to be mindful of the timelines. People do come and go and they will change. The Center for Device and Radiologic Health is CDRH. That's the second box on the upper left-hand corner there. And the director is currently Jeffrey Shuren. So if you have any devices, IVDs, or radiologic products, this is the division or this is the center that it will go to. And then the third box on the upper left hand is going to be the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and this is CDER, and the director currently is Patricia Cavazzaroni. And there are many other boxes that you see on this screen. So for sure, depending on what product that you're working on, FDA also reviews food as well as tobacco, nutrition, over-the-counter, etc. You may be in another area of FDA. But the first three boxes is where I expect if you're in the what we traditionally call the pharmaceutical industry, those are the three boxes that you'll be spending your time with. So this is another drill down of CDER. And then if you go to CDER, they have additional offices that make up this group. And again, there are many offices here, but the group that you're going to spend, I suspect that you will spend most of your time in, is on the first row, the very last box, which is the Office of New Drugs. And this is almost everyone who are developing drugs. And that is currently led by Peter Stein. So then we'll go into the Office of New Drugs, and you'll see it breaks down in additionally to therapeutic categories. And this is really where you will spend your time. So depending on what your product is, what your therapeutic is, you'll be in the Office of Cardiology, Hematology, Endocrinology, and Nephrology. And that is OCHEN. You might hear people say OCHEN. We do like to speak in terminology that's not even English, right? That OCHEN is not a word, but it does signify the Office of Cardiology, Hematology, Endocrinology, and Nephrology. So if you have anything for cardiovascular, anything that has to do with nephrology or kidneys, renal, diabetes, lipid disorders, obesity, anything in endocrinology and anything that's non-malignant hematology, it will fall into that office of cardiology, hematology, etc. Please keep in mind, these offices do change on occasion. So for example, you'll see the third bullet here, the Office of Rare Diseases, Pediatrics, Urologic, and Reproductive Medicine. That's called OPRM. They were not called OPRM in the past. They had different groupings. It doesn't matter for you going into the future. You will have to pick amongst these offices depending on where your drugs reside. If you don't know where your product belongs, you can call a general member and explain to them what you think your product is, and then FDA will direct you to one of these offices. If you end up in the wrong office, so for example, let's say you have a hematology product, but for some reason you couldn't figure that out, and you called the Office of Neuroscience, they will route you back. So this is how you find your pathway. But again, if you cannot or don't know, even if you call the wrong office, they will send you back to the right office. Now, if you call the wrong office and you have a very particular therapeutic that's either not straightforward, it might take you a while to get to your destined home, but you'll get there. Another thing I want to mention here is when you get to your office with your product, you will be assigned a project manager, and that project manager will pretty much stay with you for the life of your program. Not the project manager individually, because they come and go, but that office that you get assigned to, unless your product changes or something else happens. So that's about all that I'm going to speak to you about today regarding the structure. I'm going to move on to what I call the pre-IND activities. So before you start your pre-IND activities, these are the items that you're going to want to take care of so that you're ready to get your IND in. So first and foremost, you want to be able to communicate with the FDA. So you need to secure your email. I assume email will be your primary mode of communication. They also take phone calls, of course. They even use fax on occasion, but I suspect that your number one mode of communication will be email. You do want to have a secure email. It needs to be encrypted with particular certificates that confirms that you have the appropriate encryption completed. So before you set yourself up, because you know you're going to have to communicate with FDA, you're going to make sure that your email communication tool is viable. So if you don't have this secured and you get into this state where you have to have communications, you won't receive any, and they will tell you, we are not able to communicate with you via email because you do not have a secure email. You also want to request a pre-assigned IND application number. So every application has a number. FDA will give you a number, and that is the number that you will use to track your application. You want to do this before you start your pre-IND, because when you make that pre-IND request, you're going to have to attach that number. That number is how you track as well as FDA tracks. Everything that you communicate with FDA in terms of submissions will be done via an ECTD structure. We'll talk about that in the upcoming few slides. And it will also be submitted through an electronic submission gateway. That's the ESG. So before you get started with your pre-IND activities, make sure you know what an ECTD is or how that looks or how to build that, because that's the format it has to be submitted in. You also want to make sure that you have established your electronic submission gateway, that portal, because that's how you push or you submit your information. So when you have communications with FDA, they will occur via email. But when you have submissions to the FDA with content, protocol, IB information requests, etc., that will happen through the gateway. So you want to take care of this so that you're poised for your Pre-Ind activities and thereafter. If you are a foreign establishment, you'll also want to have a U.S. agent identified. And this is the individual that's going to be your primary first line of communication with FDA. There's lots of reasons for this, but really from a practical standpoint, FDA wants to work, not wants to, they will only work, I'll call it US time, Eastern time, pretty much 9 to 5, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And so they want to have a US agent on US soil, keeping the same time and the same accessibility. They know how to call us. We have the same easy US numbers. They know how to communicate with, I'll call it someone in the US. When they have foreign entities like yourselves, they don't know how to dial +82 or whatever your country code is, and they don't want to, that those are long distance calls. And they also are not going to spend the time to figure out what time it is wherever you might be. There's other reasons why, but for sure you'll want to have a US agent ready for you so that, again, you can start your Pre-Ind activities. Okay, moving on. Okay, so in order to do the communications, as I've mentioned, you want to secure your email account. You're going to send them a request to this email, and you're going to explain to them who you are, why you want to communicate with the FDA, and they'll give you instructions on what to do to be able to confirm and to create your secure email account. And as I've mentioned, you want to request your pre-assigned application number, and this is how you get your numbers. There's also a list of items that you're going to provide for them when you make that request. So, for example, you tell them which division or office that your product resides in. Again, if you don't know, you'll have to be routed until you find out. They'll ask you what your product is for, the treatment of, what the product is, and so on and so forth. So there's a small list of information, but this is where you send that request to these emails, and they will send you back a application number. It typically takes 3 to 5 days or so. I don't think it takes any longer than that, but that's what you'll request. And then again, you need to make that electronic submission gateway account available and open. And there is a, I don't want to say lengthy, but it is a little bit of effort to get that done. So you want to start that procedure, and this is how you start. And then again, there's going to be steps to follow to get that done. So, well, something went wrong. Okay. Sorry, I hope you're back now. Okay, so this is my next slide. This is a very, very rudimentary, simplistic diagram of what is happening during your development. So you have your product being developed, your formulation, your chemistry manufacturing controls. And I hope yesterday, Dr. Ka-Young Park, I believe, presented upon that. So you'll have a better understanding of where that is. Then once you have a compound in a very simplistic idea, you're going to put it into initial testing in animals. And that hopefully was covered by Dr. Kim, Dr. Sean Kim yesterday. I think you might know him as Sangbin. But anyhow, once you have your product near, your formulation near what you might consider a quote product, and once you have preliminary safety data from animals, and you want to then get geared up to test in humans, you're going to have what we call a pre-IND request with FDA. a request and then a meeting with FDA, and that will set you up for the actual IND submission. So everything that I've just spoken to you in the last couple of minutes was about the pre-IND phase. Now we're going to go into what the pre-IND part looks like, and that will gear you up for the IND. The reason you're going to make that IND submission is so that you can start human clinical testing. And human clinical testing typically runs in, again, from a very simplistic model, first in man, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. Eventually, you'll get to phase 4, but for the purposes of this portion, we're just going to cover up to phase 3. If you look on this picture, I'm showing you where the IND submission occurs. Thereafter, you'll have some amendments. Eventually, you'll finish your clinical development program, your phase 1, your phase 2, phase 3 trials, and then you'll have an NDA or BLA submission. So we're going to cover our next topic, which is the pre-IND. Okay. So the pre-IND meeting is a meeting that you're going to hold with FDA. There is a particular guidance document. It's called the Formal Meetings Between the FDA and Sponsors or Applicants of PDUFA Products. This particular one came out in December 2017, and it's still in effect. So you're going to pull this document, and in it, it's again, a guidance document. It gives you tips and generalities on what to follow. I've also added the second guidance document because during COVID, which went into effect last year, it hasn't been canceled yet. There's a little bit of differences during the COVID time. This will go away once we go back to life as normal. So in order to have your pre-IND meeting, you're going to prepare your briefing package, make a meeting request, and then right before the meeting actually occurs, you're going to have preliminary comments. So FDA will send back comments to you. And at that point, if it's satisfactory to your questions, you can cancel the meeting, or if you prefer, or if it's not satisfactory, you'll continue on with the meeting. And that time frame is typically a few days before. So I have here listed for you, a pre-IND meeting is called a Type B meeting. It happens in one of several or one of 3 different ways. It can be a face-to-face down in Washington, D.C. at FDA headquarters. Right now, during COVID, that's not going to happen, but imagine in a real world, regular time frame, you could have a face-to-face meeting. Otherwise, you could also have this meeting, but it might just be a teleconference or a webinar like this, which it could be Zoom or Teams or whatever format. But it could be a teleconference only. Or this meeting can also occur in what FDA calls written responses only. And written responses only literally means they're going to write to you their responses back to you. So you're not actually going to have a meeting as we know it. You're not going to have a discussion back and forth. It's not going to be face-to-face, and it's not going to be on the phone or on the web or on a Zoom or on a Teams. It'll literally be a piece of paper, a document that they will mail back to you, and that's the end of your, quote, meeting. When you have a Type B meeting, which is a pre-IND meeting, you make your meeting request, and that if the meeting is granted, and I use the word meeting, but if it's written responses only, it's still a quote meeting, even though you don't have a meeting, you're just going to get a document written back to you. But assuming that you make a request and FDA grants you that meeting, they will tell you within 21 days if you're going to have a meeting or not have a meeting. They can deny your request. When do they deny your request? If your meeting request is poor, incomplete, inconclusive, can't be understood, or viewed as unnecessary, or any one of those or combinations of that, your meeting may not be granted. So just keep that in mind. Just because you make a meeting request does not mean you'll get granted a request. Typically, if it's denied, you have to figure out why it's denied, ask them why it's denied, and then you're going to fix it and then send it back in. Because my assumption is you needed that meeting, which is why you made the request in the first place. So within 21 days, they'll tell you they'll tell you if it's been granted. They'll tell you what kind of meeting it will be, either a face-to-face, a teleconference, or a written responses only, and then they'll give you your meeting date. The meeting date typically occurs within 60 days of your meeting request. Your briefing package, so you make the meeting request, you get a meeting date, and then you minus 30 days from that date. That's when your briefing package is due to the FDA. So if you're on day 0 and they give you a meeting 60 days later, your briefing package is due 30 days from today. And then, as I've mentioned, approximately 2-3 days prior to your meeting date. So if your meeting date is on day 60, then somewhere around day 56, 57, you will receive preliminary comments. And that's where FDA will respond to your questions in writing. And if they're satisfactory, they will ask you if you want to continue with the meeting or not. If your preliminary comments are satisfactory, those will become your meeting minutes. Assuming you receive your preliminary comments and you still want to progress with the meeting, you will hold your meeting in whichever format they granted you. And then 30 days later, you'll have meeting minutes. So that's what the full cycle of your pre-IND meeting. Okay, moving on to your briefing request. This briefing request will have your application number. I've mentioned to you before, you needed to make that request before you got to this state. So you will have your application number, you put it down, you put down your product name. If you don't have an actual name, your product name could be a product code. If your company uses, letters, numbers, what have you, so it could be a product. Your product name might just be a code. You should have a chemical name or an established name or a structure, depending on what state your drug is at. You're going to have to tell them what your proposed regulatory pathway is. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Your proposed indication, and then the sponsor, that would be you. You're going to request the type of meeting. It's either type A, type B, or type C, and the type of format of the meeting that you want. So if you're going to the FDA for a pre-IND meeting, that is a type B meeting. And if you want to fly into Washington, D.C., you're going to request a face-to-face meeting. So your meeting request is going to say, for this bullet or for this section, you're going to say a type B meeting, parentheses, pre-IND, close parentheses, meeting is requested. We would request a face-to-face meeting. And knowing that you're in Korea, perhaps you can't fly in, you'll want to have a teleconference instead. But anyhow, this is when the sponsor makes this request. FDA will grant you the meeting or not, but they will grant you what they want to grant you. So you may request a face-to-face, but you may only get a teleconference. Or you may request a teleconference, but FDA may grant you only a written response only communication. So this is the request. This is what the sponsor asks for. You may or may not get what you ask for from the FDA. In your request, you're going to include the list of participants. And I put in here draft. Typically, when you make the meeting request, you're not 100% sure on who can and cannot attend for various reasons. So this is your list of participants, proposed participants. And then you're going to have the most important part of this meeting request, which is your list of proposed questions. What are you asking the FDA? What is it that you need them to impart for you? And so you have to list those questions here. And then as a sponsor, you're also going to suggest dates and times, especially any blackout dates that you cannot meet. So if you are meeting and you're projecting approximately 60 days out, because this meeting gets granted within 60 days, if it's granted. So today is September, October, November. At the end of November, we here in the US, we have Thanksgiving, which is a major holiday. So you're going to say, we are not going to meet on Thanksgiving, which is, I don't know what it is today, this year, 20 something, which shouldn't be a problem because FDA is not going to meet with you on that date either, because that's a national holiday for them. But imagine if you had particular dates that you couldn't fly out because maybe it's a Korean holiday, maybe it's somebody's birthday and you know that individual just doesn't want to take it on that date. So you are going to suggest your dates and times. Sometimes when I have teleconferences with team members that are not all in the same time zone, I'm very particular about the times that I request. So I don't want to have a 4 p.m. meeting, for example, 4 p.m. Eastern time meeting, if I have European team members, because that will be 10 o'clock for them. So I will say to FDA, may I have, we humbly request times between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. if possible, right? So that I want to keep the meeting time in the morning for that reason. Other times when I'm meeting in DC with my team, I specifically request an afternoon meeting because typically the team prefers an afternoon meeting. So we'll get up in the morning, have our breakfast, meet as a team, review our questions, review our strategy, take a break, get down to the DC office, have our afternoon meeting. So sometimes I'll request an afternoon meeting for those reasons. And then of course the typical response is we want a meeting as soon as possible. So 9 out of 10 times, the request that I send down to the FDA is going to say something like, we would like to meet with you as soon as possible, any day, any time. Because when we're in development mode, we just want to get to the FDA quicker rather than later, and everything's been delayed. But if you're a good planner, you should understand the timelines that I've shown you, and that'll help you understand how to make that request. All right. Sorry, this is the next slide. So as I've mentioned earlier, you're going to make the meeting request. I just showed you the contents that you're going to put in that meeting request. It goes down, and in about 21 days, within 21 days, hopefully you'll be granted your meeting with the meeting date. And then 30 days prior to that meeting date, this is when your briefing package is due. In your briefing package, you're going to include everything that you've included already in your meeting request, which is your application number, your product name, your indication, proposed indication, your proposed regulatory route, etc. And here you're going to provide now your final list of participants. This is who you plan to bring down. Your briefing package will include your final list of questions. And then your briefing package provides the background of your development, your current state, and then the most important part, which is the data that supports your question. So it really is what you provide to the agency to explain and to support your, I'm going to call it position. Most of the questions, the way they're written is, the final question is really, dear FDA, do you agree? Right? So you, the sponsor, will put together a roadmap of why you're doing whatever you propose to do, why you're testing or you propose to test your program in a certain way with a particular endpoint, for example. And at the end, you'll say, and do you agree? And so the data that you provide to support that will explain in your disease state for reasons 1, 2, 3, the rationale that you have adopted or proposed to adopt is sound and supported by evidence. And that's really the data to support. This is where you include your data if you have conducted studies in the past, or borrowed data if you're looking at other programs, other people's programs, but that's where it goes. The briefing package is a brief package. So this is not intended to be hundreds of pages. So you should not include clinical study reports, for example. They're not going to read it. The briefing package is somewhere around 50 to 100 pages, if I'm not mistaken. But it is a brief package, even though I've spent a lot of time to explain how important it is to provide supporting data. So, okay, so now I assume that you've submitted the briefing package. You've had a great meeting with the FDA. You've then received your meeting minutes, and now you're ready to move on to your actual IND. So this is the web address where you can go and look at the IND regulations. I've given you a picture of what the regulations look like. And if you click on each of these numbers, not in the slide that I've provided you, but when you go to the website, the portal, and you click on each number, it will open up the actual regulations so you can read about them. The one that's going to be most important is going to be Title 21, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 312, Section 0.23, and that talks about your IND content and format. And so when you pull that up, it's actually quite a short list, but it tells you that you're going to need certain information. The regulations are written very light, and they're very easy to read. I suspect your rudimentary English is all that you need to be able to read this. However, the hard part, I think, is because it's written very broad and open, it might be very difficult to understand, well, what does that really mean? So that's probably the hardest part. But the regulations themselves are quite simplistic and very straightforward, most of them. So now you're ready to compile your IND. The IND is structured in what we call a CTD, which is your Common Technical Documents. And then there's a little E, which means it's going to be done electronically. So everything in here is an electronic document. And the CTD triangle, which you'll hear if you're in regulatory affairs, is 5 modules. Very simplistic, and I'll start from bottom up. So module 5 is basically where all of your clinical information sits. Anything that you've conducted or tested or determined to be of human nature, so come from clinical information, goes into module 5. And then moving up to module 4 is, again, any testing that you've done in animals, in vitro, basically non-humans, sits in module 4. And then moving up to module 3, anything that you've done to your product to develop it, be it testing, formulations, what we like to call quality or chemistry manufacturing controls, all of that sits in module 3. So if you look at the pyramid, module 3, 4, and 5 is really the base of your triangle. It creates the foundation of your application. Then moving up to the middle section of the triangle, you have module 2. Module 2 are summaries of modules 3, 4, and 5. And if you look at the way the triangle is structured, on the first part of that middle column is going to be your quality overall summary, which is module 2.3. So 2.3, so your module 3 is your quality or your CMC. It rolls up into a summary document. The summary sits in module 2, and that's 2.3. So if you go from the left-hand side, can you see my mouse? You can see my mouse. Here's module 3, and the summary rolls up to module 2.3. And as I've mentioned, module 4 is your non-clinical animal studies, and it rolls up to summaries, And there's two sections, Summary 2.4 and Summary 2.6. So it's Module 2.4 and Module 2.6. And they sit right on top of your Module Quote 4 in this triangle diagram. Then you have Module 5, I've just mentioned. That is everything that has to do with clinical data. And then when you roll up, you have two summaries, 2.5 and 2.7. So Module 2.5, Module 2.7, those two sections are the summaries of clinical information. And then you go to the very top of your pyramid, your triangle right here, which is your Module 1, and we call those our administrative documents. That's going to be your cover letter, your reviewer's guide, your forms, your package insert, your communications with the agency, your pediatric information, basically everything else that doesn't fit into 3, 4, and 5. So if it doesn't belong in 3, 4, and 5, it most likely will belong in 1. That's kind of the catch-all. And then everything Module 2 were summaries of 3, 4, and 5. So by default, it also wouldn't fit in Module 2. So this is what your ECTD or CTD application looks like. It's in 5 modules, and this is what your IND will look like. This is how you're going to structure your communications with FDA when you make those submissions, and this is pushed out to them through the electronic gateway, submissions gateway, which is the ESG. So now we're delving into what does your Module 1 actually look like. So this is your administrative module, and these are typically the contents that you're going to need to incorporate. You'll need your forms, and specifically 99.9% of the time, you're going to need your Form 1571, your Form 1572, your Form 3674. There could be other forms in there, but these 3 are really what I would expect you to need 99% of the time. You might go in with just the 1571 and 3674. The 1572, you might want to, you can skip until your following submission. I typically include it in my first IND submission, but it's not required. So if you wanted to split it, you could always split that. Then you have a cover letter, as I mentioned before. You have Module 1.3, which is your contact information. If there's been any transfer of obligations, you'll list them there. You will include your pre-IND activities. So here we're working on building the IND application, which means you should have had a pre-IND interaction with the agency. That's where that information is placed. And moving on to section 1.9, you should have your pediatric study plan incorporated in your IND. The timelines for your pediatric development there's some flexibility there. So you may or may not need it at the time of your IND. It just depends on the state of your development program and what you're opening your IND with. Everybody's going to open their IND at a different time point depending on your development. It could happen at first in man. It could happen at phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So depending on the time point of when you're opening your IND, it'll make your contents a little bit different. Then you have to make a statement about environmental analysis. You have to include your investigator brochure and your investigational drug labeling, which will ultimately morph into your package insert. But at the IND stage, it'll just be investigational drug labeling. And then you'll need a general investigative plan, basically what you're planning to study, how you're going to conduct them, and then upcoming studies. In this view, I have a few items, which is 1.4, 1.7, and 1.8. These are typically not likely to occur for your IND. However, what I'm showing you is a bigger picture of the IND or Module 1 structure. So depending on your program, you may have data or documents that sit in there. So for example, we'll talk about designations later, But if you have a fast track designation request, you would then have a 1.7. That's not everybody, but again, I'm just showing you what a typical IND looks like, and then some, I'll call them special INDs or more unique INDs, and there's other sections, but I've made them de-highlighted. So moving on. I've mentioned the forms before. Every IND will have a form 1571, and this is exactly what the form looks like. I haven't checked. Yes, I just did. So this is what the forms look like. They do expire. So if you look at your form right here in the upper right-hand corner right here, you'll see a little date here, and this one goes out to 2022. So you just want to be mindful of that. Somewhere in 2022, there's going to be another form that comes out. So be sure you're using the right form. There's a lot of boxes to fill out. Most of it is very straightforward, name, address, and so on. And I've highlighted this section in blue, which is the most important thing. So you as a sponsor, you're going to sign this form and you're going to drop it into module 1.1, which is where forms live. Let me highlight the blue text for you. So this is the blue text from the prior form, and this is what you're signing to. You are signing that you are not going to begin your clinical activities until 30 days after FDA receives your IND. So today is, I don't know what date it is, but if you submitted your IND today, you'll wait 30 days, and then you can commence on your studies, whatever your investigation is. So this is what you're signing to. So you're attesting to FDA. That is correct. I am not going to start anything until 30 days after FDA's receipt or submission. They receive pretty much same day that you submit because it's going in through the electronic submission gateway. So it'll get clocked. The day you submit is really the day that they receive. Why 30 days? Because that's how long FDA takes to review your IND. During those 30 days, you will receive, if you're going to have a hold of some kind, typically a clinical hold. But so the next sentence specifically says, I also agree not to begin or continue clinical investigations if you receive a clinical hold or a financial hold or any kind of hold. So you give FDA 30 days to review your IND. During those 30 days, you will get a hold or something. And if you do, you cannot start your activities. You also agree that you have an institutional review board or an ethics committee that's going to review your trial or trials, and that you will not start your clinical trials without that. And then you also agree as a sponsor to conduct the investigation in accord with all other regulatory requirements. So this is what the 1571, the form F1571 is really for. It's for you to attest to these items, and then that's what you're signing against. Okay. Another form that I mentioned is the form 1572. This is actually signed by your principal investigators or your clinical site staff. And again, I've highlighted the section in blue. This is the most important part of this form. Everything else is pretty self-explanatory. They're going to write their name, affiliation, and so forth. And then this text in blue is what's super important. What does that look like? This is what it looks like. You see a lot of I agree. So your investigator is agreeing to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 very specific items. Item number 1, they have to follow the protocol, the current protocol. Item number 2 is they are attesting that they will personally conduct the trial. Item number 3 is they are going to tell their test subjects, their patients that are participating, that they are being tested, they are receiving investigational product. Item number 4 is if there are any adverse events, the investigator will report them accordingly. Item number 5 is if he or she, your principal investigator, is also receiving additional support from other healthcare professionals, usually study coordinators, they are attesting that they will be informed about the study. So, item number 5 talks about the principal investigator keeping adequate and accurate records. Item number 7 is the exact same point as I mentioned earlier by the sponsor, that an IRB, Investigational Review Board, has reviewed and endorsed the study, that you may conduct it, and that it's ethical. And then the last one is that they will comply with all other requirements and obligations that clinical investigators are supposed to follow and all the regulations. So these are the items that your PI is signing. All of these items follow GCP as well. And this becomes super important later because your investigator is signing this at the beginning of a study, at the beginning of their trial, and later on after they complete their trial, when they get audited or inspected, I will tell you that one or more of these items are the findings that FDA will have. And then they'll go back to the investigator and say, see, at the beginning, you attested, you agreed to these items, and yet during the conduct of that study, you have violated whatever ones that they have violated. Typically, it's item 1. Your investigators will end up not following the protocol for various reasons, and they'll have protocol violations. It's very rare, but sometimes they won't have IRB approval because of timing, meaning they thought it went to the IRB, but they were working on protocol version X, and the IRB hadn't approved that. But in any case, this is what they attest to. These all follow GCP, and after the conduct of the study, they will invariably violate one or more of these items when they have findings. Next slide. I'm moving on to the third form that I mentioned, which again will be part of your IND. It's the form 3674. This is exactly what it looks like. This is a little bit of simpler form. And again, I've highlighted the text in blue. That's super important. And this is what you're signing against. This is signed by the sponsor. So here is the section in blue. There's really box number 9 that is very important. You have to check off one of these boxes. It's either A, B, or C. A means you don't certificate. A means that you have no clinical trials in your application, and therefore it doesn't pertain to you. So that's when you check off box A. Box B is you do have clinical trials, but it doesn't require certification. And then box C is you do have clinical trials and you do need certification and posting. And when you click on box C, it automatically triggers box 10, you'll see below. And then you have to add in your NCT codes, which is your National Clinical Trials number. And you get that number from clinicaltrials.gov. So it takes about 3 to 7-ish days to get your NCT code once you post. And I say 3 to 7, approximately 3 to 7 days, because the number of days that it takes for your study to post and to get your NCT number depends on how well you've completed all the criteria at clinicaltrials.gov. If you're proficient, you should be done, and screening will be completed and you'll get your number quickly. If you're not proficient and you have errors or revisions that are required, your cycle might take longer. So you want to account for this activity before you get to your IND submission date. So this actually fits in your, I call it your pre-IND activities. So you're going to want to go into clinicaltrials.gov, post your studies if they qualify for posting. So if C is triggered, you're going to want to do that, get your NCT numbers, complete this form in advance of your IND submission so that you are poised and your IND is complete. Moving on to Module 2. This is your summary documents that I've mentioned earlier in the pyramid. So when you expand everything in Module 2, I mentioned to you, Module 3 is rolled up into Module 2.3, which is the quality overall summary. Module 4 is rolled up into Module 2.4, which is your non-clinical overview, and Module 2.6. Within Module 2.6, you have seven subcategories, and each of these items is a document. So you're going to have 7 documents in Module 2.6. In Module 2.4, you have 1 document, which is a non-clinical overview. Same thing with Module 5. It rolls up into Module 2.5 and Module 2.7. And in 2.7, there's 6 sub-documents or documents. They're not sub-documents, they're actual documents. So there's going to be 6 of them in Module 2.7. And then in Module 2.5, you have 1 document, which is the clinical overview. And I didn't mention it earlier because this wasn't part of the pyramid, but you also have a Module 2.2, which is your introduction to the summary section. And this is typically about 3, maybe 5 pages long. It's a very brief document, and it just tells you that what the additional modules are and what they'll be covered. And so all of these items are your Module 2 summary documents. Module 3 is quite extensive, and I'm not going to go through all the items. I'm very hopeful that this was covered by Dr. Park yesterday. And so everything that she discussed, they will have a home in Module 3, and they will fit in here. Basically, it's set up with drug substance and then drug product. Same thing with Module 4. When you break down Module 4, all your categories of non-clinical studies will fit into each of these main areas: pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, or toxicology, and then they have subsections. And again, everything that Dr. Kim covered yesterday will have a home, and this is where your documents will sit in your study reports. Same thing with Module 5. All of your clinical studies that you may have conducted will sit in one of these areas. If you're going first in man or phase 1, or you have no clinical studies, which is typically your IND state, but you could be in an atypical scenario where you have conducted studies either elsewhere or previously in another country, who knows, or clinical literature information, but this is where they'll reside. And so you will find, so if you don't have any studies to put into these areas, what you should be dropping in is your study protocol. So when you submit your IND, typically you don't have any clinical studies that are ongoing or have completed. And so within this section, you'll have a protocol, a PK protocol, for example, versus a PK study report. Later on, you'll add the study report into that section. But for now, in your IND state, you will only have a protocol. And that's what will, this is where you'll place that protocol, or protocols, plural, if you're submitting more than one protocol to be conducted in your IND. Okay, so you've built your ECTD in the pyramid fashion. It does not physically look like a pyramid when it's built, right? It will look like just a series of documents in modules 1, modules 2, module 3, module 4, and module 5. If If there's nothing to put in a module or nothing to put in a particular section, you just leave it blank because there's nothing that gets placed there. You do not put a piece of paper that says, we do not have a PK report or we are leaving this section blank. No, you just literally leave it blank. So you've compiled your IND into ECTD structure. You've submitted it via the ESG, the Electronic Submission Gateway. And then what happens? Nothing. So you will have what we'll call silence. After 30 days, your IND goes into effect. It is not, quote, approved. FDA doesn't approve INDs, but it will go into effect and you are welcome to start your clinical activities. If you recall earlier, you had signed and submitted with your IND Form 1571, which specifically stated that you would wait the 30 days and you would not conduct anything if a clinical hold occurred. But if you have silence, that means you don't have a clinical hold or any kind of hold. You will get, actually it's a little bit, silence is probably not exactly correct, but you will get a letter, probably somewhere near the day 30 mark, you will get a letter that confirms the receipt of your IND. So you can clock your date, and that's how you know when your 30 days are up. Okay, so if you don't have silence and you hear, I'll call it noise, what do you hear? You may get what we call, or what FDA calls, information request. That's literally a question or a comment or something that they need. For example, on occasion, you might get a request for an informed consent form. So typically the IND does not include an ICF form with your IND package, but depending on your application, depending on your disease state, depending on your study design, that could be something of interest, and then they'll ask for it. So they might say, hey, please submit your ICF. Or they may ask you to submit something else that they want additional clarification on. Or they may request data if you've submitted a study report, for example, from a study that you've conducted previously or from that has been completed, and they're interested in the results from that for whatever reason. Maybe they need more clarification on dosing, dose ranges, dose amounts, who knows? I mean, the questions can be anything and everything that has to do with your IND. They can be simple questions where you've forgotten a form, for example. I've mentioned the 1571 and the 3674. Let's say you don't submit one of those. It could be as simple as, hey, you're missing a form, where is it? At which point you'll hopefully procure one and obviously send it in. Or it could be very intensive, where they have a series of, I'll say, clinical questions or non-clinical questions or even CMC related questions. So basically you'll get information requests, plural. Whenever you get them, you want to respond to them as quickly as possible. Most of the time, FDA will tell you when they want it. They'll tell you we need this back in 2 days, 3 days. Sometimes they may give you a little bit longer time depending on what the request is. And then barring that, you could get a full clinical hold or a partial clinical hold, and they will tell you why they're giving you an hold and why, what you have to do or what you have to produce or what you have to clarify to come out of clinical hold. And so if you're on clinical hold, you cannot start any clinical activities, investigation activities, or if you had already started, so your clinical hold can happen within that 30-day period, at which point you hadn't even started yet, so you can't start until you're done with clinical hold, or your clinical hold can come at any day post day 30. So day 30 happens on day 31, you start your investigations, and your clinical hold might come to you at day 45, day 60, day 90, day 365. Who the heck knows? It can come at an arbitrary date. It depends on why they're providing, why one is being triggered. So if you get a clinical hold, you have to stop activities. If you get a partial clinical hold, it will tell you which activities you have to stop. Sometimes you can continue with enrollment, but you cannot, add additional patients, or sometimes you can finish treating patients who are in study, but you can't add any additional sites. Who knows? But anyhow, you are going to be very mindful of your clinical hold if and when it ever arrives. Okay, so your IND is in effect after day 30, assuming no clinical hold, and you've started your clinical trials, you have your initial protocol or protocols that you've submitted with the IND. Thereafter, you may be working on new trials, so you'll be adding in new protocols. Your protocols that have been being executed and your trials are running, you might have protocol amendments to that protocol, so you'll be submitting your protocol amendments to your IND. Every time you submit to your IND, it's called an IND amendment. When you have new sites or new investigators, you're going to submit your Form 1572 plus their CV or a summary of qualifications. We typically submit a CV to capture all that, but it doesn't have to be a CV, but you're going to submit those within 30 days of adding a new site or a new investigator. And that goes into your IND. And then as you complete your protocols or your trials, you'll have study reports and you'll add your completed reports to your IND. And those are your amendments. You're also going to add, or you're also going to have to report IND safety reports, and these are your adverse events. So earlier I mentioned in your 1572, your physician attested to making sure that they reported safety reports, and those safety reports come into the sponsor, and we, the sponsor, or you, the sponsor, will submit your safety report to your IND. Specifically, this is covered in Regulation 312.32, so please be sure to review that. So when you have a serious or life-threatening adverse event, which is suspected, which means it's related to the drug or you think it's related to the drug, and it's unexpected, so it's not listed in your investigational brochure, that's what triggers that adverse event from needing expedited reporting. And expedited reporting is real time, and it has to come in 15 calendar days from your determination of these criteria. And if that event happens to be fatal, somebody died, or is life-threatening, then you have to submit that within 7 calendar days. And there's a lovely guidance that helps you understand what needs to be submitted, when it needs to be submitted, how it needs to be submitted. So please pull this guidance, read it carefully, and follow it very carefully. You also need to have an IND annual report, and the format, you can choose to submit it as a Development Safety Update Report, a DSUR. It goes in once a year, so it's annual, and you clock it to your IND effective date. So if you submit your IND today, it goes into effect 30 days from now. 365 days from that date is your reporting period. And then the report, the DSUR report, is submitted to the agency within 60 days of the end of your reporting period. So you do this once a year. And again, there's a very particular guidance document that will help you on how to structure this, what to include, how to create it. This too will be submitted to the FDA as an amendment to your IND in eCTD format via the ESG, which is the Electronic Submission Gateway. Okay, so now there are a few additional designations that you can add on to your IND. And what you'll hear is either fast track, breakthrough, or accelerated. These are individual designations. So fast track is a designation in and of itself. Breakthrough is a designation in and of itself. And accelerated is a designation. You can have more than one designation, or you can have all 3 designations. Very rare to go for all of them because it's not necessary. but you can have more than one. So they're not exclusive of each other. So just going down the first column, which is the fast track, you're going to request the fast track to the IND, and it should be requested prior to your pre-submission meeting. So typically your pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but you're going to request your fast track designation before that time point in your development. You do need to have an IND in order to make this request because that's where you submit it to. And if you will recall way back in the module 1 picture that I showed you several slides ago, I think this is module 1.7. I hope I'm right. But anyways, go look that up. But this is where you would drop in your request to your IND for a fast track designation. The criteria for this is for serious and life-threatening conditions. And I've highlighted a term or one word in this column, which is probably the most important thing that people will trigger this. The reason that you're going to request fast track is when you have preliminary non-clinical or clinical evidence that shows your product has the potential to address an unmet medical need. But the most important thing here is what I call non-clinical data. So if you remember my very generic drug development picture, you have your formulation, the product being developed, you go into animal preclinical studies, and that's when, if you have sufficient evidence, or you think you have sufficient evidence, that is when you trigger, hey, I think I need, or I want, not I need, I want fast track designation. You might have enough data to put your request together. Why would you do this? The benefits from having a fast track designation or any of these designations is you are then able to have more frequent FDA interaction. This means you can have more meetings, more written responses only throughout the life of your development. Typically, and I'll show you the picture again, you don't get very many touch points with the FDA during development. But when you have fast track designation, it allows you to have more interaction by having this designation. It also incentivizes the FDA to help you with actions on how to expedite your development. So those two things kind of go hand in hand. Here, what FDA is saying is if you have fast track designation, or when you get fast track designations, they're going to be really seriously helpful for you, for your product to progress. Why? Because you have expressed that your non-clinical data or clinical evidence, but typically it brings it back even earlier before you have clinical evidence, that you think there's a signal or some evidence, however way you want to categorize that, as having a potential product. So that's why you're going to seek fast track designation. You also have additional benefits once your program has a fast track designation. When you submit your application, your NDA or BLA, and that's called a rolling review by FDA. So what rolling review means is that FDA may look at parts of your application before the full application has been compiled and submitted. So normally when you submit your NDA or BLA, it's a complete submission. You put everything in there, you push a button, and away it goes. But in a rolling review, you might be able to send in, for example, module 3 is complete, and you'll submit module 3, even though your module 4 and 5 might still not be completed yet. So you can submit that, and FDA may review that module while you're still compiling other modules, and they may, start earlier in the review. However, when they clock you, and I'll show you the NDA or your application review time, they're still going to clock you on the normal schedule. So I use these words as may, as it could be helpful and it's designed to be quicker and expedite your application, but it may not. And then when you have fast track designation, it also makes you eligible for priority review. We'll talk about priority review a little bit later. The most important thing to remember for fast track is your designation may be rescinded if it's no longer meets the need. So let's say you had your preliminary non-clinical evidence and it showed some, wow, it's going to really revolutionize whatever therapy and that indication. Come a year or two later, or whatever time frame goes, or additional studies have been conducted, or your clinical studies have been conducted, and now it looks like your product is really not so wow any longer. You could have your fast track designation rescinded or taken back, which then means you will no longer have those, quote, frequent meetings with FDA. You may no longer receive additional activities to help expedite the development, and you definitely won't have your rolling review, and you may not be eligible for priority review any longer. So just keep that in mind. This is meant to help you, the sponsor, move along faster and better. FDA to help you, but if it turns out that no, it's really, your product is not so so great, or the potential is not so great, it could just be taken back. So that's fast track. And moving on to your second column, which is your breakthrough. Breakthrough designation, again, you want to request it during your IND. Here you want to request it before your end of phase 2 meeting. So before you get to your phase 3. And this makes sense because if you wait any longer post your end of phase 2, the benefits of having this designation is really run out of time. Again, this is for serious and life-threatening conditions. And here, this is where you have clinical evidence, right? While you're studying your phase 1, really, maybe early phase 2, this is when your clinical evidence shows that your drug has a very good potential for some significant improvement over existing therapies, or it is a therapy or a treatment for an indication that has no treatment. So it's not substantially better when there is nothing. And the reason why you want to make this request again before your end of phase 2 is if you wait up until that point, your helpfulness of this designation time has run out. So what are the benefits? Again, this will having this designation will allow you to have more frequent FDA interactions, more meetings, more written responses, etc. DAY2 will help you with additional activities to help expedite your development. Not just expedite, but better tips on like your study design, for example. Here, when you have breakthrough designation, FDA, senior members of FDA will commit to your product, your program. So not only is your review division, if we went earlier in that CDER, CDRH picture, not only at your office level, but it will go up, all the way up the food chain, all the way to the commissioner if need be, all the way to Janet Woodcock. And they are saying this is a product that really needs to make it quick. This is going to save lives or treat people. And so you get senior FDA commitment when you have breakthrough designation. Also, the benefits, again, same thing with the rolling review, same thing with the eligibility for priority review. We'll talk about the timelines for priority review in a little bit later. And again, your breakthrough designation can be taken away from you if your preliminary clinical evidence really then demonstrates it's really not that great and it's just a product versus a very meaningful product. So it can go away. And the last column we're going to talk about is accelerated designation. And here you can make this request at any time of your development program, or any time during your clinical development program. And this is also for serious or life-threatening conditions. And here, the criteria that you're asking for is the endpoint of your development, your clinical development. So when you have a clinical endpoint that takes a very long time to reach, so sometimes, for example, it could be your endpoint might be death if you're looking at, for example, cancer research. And maybe depending on your oncology, your cancer type, maybe death doesn't happen so quickly and it takes years. Let's say a treatment effect would be 4 or 5 years before you really knew if your drug was going to work or not. Well, you can't have a study program that takes so long because maybe it shows great signs based on surrogate endpoints, maybe on blood markers or proteins or whatever else that you can measure instead of measuring the actual endpoint, which could be death, if it's something that takes years and years and years before you can seriously confirm that your product is working. And what FDA is saying is that maybe the product should be made available to the public, to the American public, because it has the potential for that treatment, but it just takes such a long time to get to that real endpoint. They'll allow you to use a surrogate endpoint to demonstrate the clinical effectiveness of your product. So therefore, if you have an accelerated designation and you are able to use a surrogate endpoint instead of the real endpoint, whatever it might be, you're going to shorten the clinical research from, let's say, years down to whatever that surrogate endpoint time frame is. Typically, surrogate endpoints are shorter to measure. A change in that endpoint is shorter to measure than whatever the actual clinical endpoint is. And again, here you don't get rolling review as a benefit, but you do get eligibility for priority review. And post-approval, most likely you will have a post-marketing requirements, because basically you have to finish up the trials that take so long for that endpoint to be realized. And then here, because you've actually received an NDA approval, your approval might be withdrawn if your post-marketing trial, quote, years later, doesn't demonstrate the actual benefit of your surrogate endpoint. So keep that in mind. So those are the designations, and I'll move on. So up until now, we've had your IND submitted. You're thinking about different designations that might help you progress your development of your compound. And I'm assuming you finished up your phase 1s, your phase 2s, and now you're gearing up to start your phase 3 clinical trials. Typically, before you start your phase 3 clinical trial, you want to stop, regroup, check in with the agency, with the FDA, to make sure your phase 3 clinical development is on track and will be able to meet the endpoints and the trial designs to secure your application and approval. So that's what you're going to go into. So earlier I showed you this picture. It's the exact same, but that was a pre-IND meeting. Here we're changing over to a end of phase meeting, and specifically an end of phase 2 meeting. And it's exactly the same process. You're going to make a briefing package, make a meeting request. You're going to get preliminary comments. FDA is going to give you meeting minutes. And again, the meeting could be face-to-face, a teleconference, a written responses only. Here, the timelines change a little bit. So when you have a type B pre-IND meeting, your meeting granted time was within 21 days. Here, when you have a type B end of phase meeting, your meeting granted time is within 14 days. Earlier, when you had a type B pre-IND meeting, your briefing package was due minus 30 days from your meeting date. And here, for a type B end of phase 2 meeting, it's going to be minus 50 days from your meeting date. Same thing with your preliminary comments. They come about 3 to 5 days or so before the meeting. And once you receive them, if you're satisfied, you can cancel your meeting, or you can progress and hold the meeting. And the meeting granted date will be 70 days from your meeting request, and then 30 days for your meeting minutes. So your dates on when they're granted and when your briefing package is due and when the meeting occurs is a little bit shifted, a little bit different, but the process is the exact same. So you'll have your end of phase 2 meeting, you'll discuss your phase 3 development program, and then you'll conduct your phase 3. So here's the picture again, no different than before. We talked about the pre-IND, the pre-IND activities. We talked about your pre-IND. We talked about your IND submission, your IND amendments, and now we're at the end of phase 2 meeting. You're going to gear up, start your phase 3 trials and complete them. And your next step is going to be your pre-submission meeting, which is your pre-NDA meeting. So as you gear up to go to have your pre-NDA or pre-BLA, pre-submission meeting, again, you will have already taken care of all of these items, the communications, the secure emails, the assigned IND application number, your gateway account, and your US agent. You're going to make another request, and this time you're going to make a request for your NDA or BLA application number. It's the exact same process, but this time instead of saying, I need an IND or you're gearing up for an IND, you're going to say you're gearing up for an NDA or BLA. For those of you who will start at this step, I've just flashed up the 4 bullets because you're going to want to do this now. Actually, the first 3 bullets. The request the pre-assigned IND, you can skip because you're not going to have an IND. You're going to go right into an NDA BLA. So that's why it's here for those of you who are starting at this step. You don't always have to start, obviously, at the pre-IND or IND state. Just depends on your development. So you make your request, and now you'll have a NDA or BLA application number. And that's the same number that you used for your pre-submission meeting request. So now we're getting ready to have a pre-NDA meeting. Exact same thing that I've just shared with you as the pre-IND meeting. All the dates are the same. The procedures are the same. The only difference here is instead of a type B pre-IND meeting, you're having a type B pre-NDA meeting. Exactly the same. So much earlier, we talked about your meeting request. One of the items that one of the bullets on that request is talking about the regulatory pathway. You have to designate what you propose your pathway is. And here are your typical regulatory pathways for new NDAs or BLAs. They come in 2 flavors for NDAs. It's either a section 505B1 or a 505B2. The difference between the two is when you have a B1 submission, you, the sponsor, are creating or including full reports of everything safety and everything efficacy, and that you, the sponsor, you own or have rights to reference that information. When you submit a 505B2 NDA, again, it's a full NDA. There's no difference there. And you will contain full reports of safety and efficacy. However, some of the information you may not have conducted yourself, and or some of the information you may not even have the right of reference. And so here you're going to rely on FDA's prior review of safety and efficacy of that product or similar product in order to supplement your application. So that's the only 2 difference between these kinds of NDAs. And then if you're working on a BLA, it'll be section 351A, and if it's a biosimilar, it's a 351K. I don't have generics up here, but that would be a 505J. And this is just a reminder that when you submit an application, an NDA or BLA to the FDA, it is not free. It's actually quite expensive. It's about $3 million US dollars to make your NDA or BLA submission. And then even after you've made your submission and assuming you have approval and you have a product, you will continue to have program fees, which range in about, $300,000 plus a year. And then when you have biosimilar, you have different fees. And then down in the green, when you have the PDUFA product FDA meetings, meaning your pre-IND meeting, your end of phase 2 meeting, your pre-submission or pre-NDA meeting, all of that was, quote, free. So you don't pay to have those meetings. However, when you have a biosimilar development, you do pay to hold those meetings, and they're different prices. So they're just shaded for you. So keep that in mind. So it's very expensive to just make a submission to the FDA of an application. There are no fees to submit your IND. So now I'm switching gears, and we're going to talk about your NDA. And I won't spend too much time here because it's the exact same ECTD structure. Your NDA is going to be in the 5-module structure. Exactly the same. Everything clinical is in module 5. Everything non-clinical is in module 4. Everything quality/chemistry manufacturing controls is in module 3. Each of the modules roll up into summary documents sitting in module 2. And your module 1 is your administrative section. Here's a picture of what module 1 looks like. It is slightly different than your previous IND module. Your forms have now changed. You'll see the numbers are different. You will have a cover letter, which you had in your IND. In your application, you're going to typically include what we call a reviewer's guide. And that's just a roadmap for the FDA to help them follow along in your application. And you'll add in their notes of anything interesting or quirky or things that you put in the wrong place intentionally. If you have omitted something, you'll explain why you don't have it so they don't ask for it. Module 1.3, very important. In addition to contact information that you have from before, you're going to need your debarment statement, your financial disclosure statement, and of course, patents for your exclusivity later on. Everything else is pretty straightforward from before. 114 used to be your investigational labeling, and now it's going to be your product labeling, which means your packaging configuration, I'll call them pictures labels, as well as your package insert. I have in here module 1.18, which talks about your proprietary name. So drugs here in the US have a trade name. Actually, drugs all around the world have a trade name, which is your branded name. You're going to make your proprietary name submission not in your NDA, but as your second sequence. So it goes in back to back, but I have it highlighted here, so I'll remind you to submit it immediately thereafter, but it does go in separately. Oops, back one. So in terms of your proprietary name, you could have submitted this during your IND stage. So you'll have to determine if you've made that submission previously during your IND development stage. If you'll still need to make that submission to confirm, but different sponsors submit them at different times. Just depends on your development. Okay, so here's Form 356. Just a quick flash. I'm not going to talk much about it, but just showing you what it looks like so you can Google. You can Google all the forms. FDA has a web page that has all the forms listed. So you can go pull them up there. Module 2, exactly same as before, nothing different. Now, of course, the content is different because at this point in your application, you will have completed a whole series of clinical trials, a whole series of non-clinical trials. And so all of these sections are going to be very, very robust. Except unless you have a very small program or a small product. If you have a very small product where you only have 1 or 2 clinical studies, a handful of non-clinical studies, then of course, all your summary modules will of course be small as well. Modules 3, 4, and 5, exactly same as before. Again, the only difference from before to now, before meaning during your IND development to now, is you will have a lot of final study reports. So your modules are much, much more robust. Your module 3 will contain approval ready material. So everything will have been updated. The only thing I want to point out here is in module 5, which is very different in your application than in any other module 5 around the world or any of your other regulatory agencies, as well as completely different than your IND, are these 4 major topics, which is you're going to need an ISS, which is the Integrated Summary of Safety, an ISE, which is the Integrated Summary of Efficacy, Office of Scientific Investigation Information, which lists out the sites that have been used and along with it, lots of supplementary information. And specific to the US application, you're going to need data, raw data, data sets, and SAS in a very particular manner of providing data, which is not done by not requested by any other agency in the world that I'm aware of. But this is included at the get-go of your application. Earlier, I mentioned your reviewer's guide, where you're going to give notes about sections that are, for example, omitted. On rare occasions, you can omit your ISS and ISE. Typically, that happens when you have a very small application. If you only have 2-3 studies or studies that cannot be integrated, because these are integrated summaries of safety and efficacy, then you would omit your ISS and ISE and just utilize your Module 2 summaries. When you omit required documents or sections, you are going to have had that discussion during your pre-submission meeting or at some point prior to your application being submitted. You don't want to leave things out and didn't have a prior discussion of it until this point. What that will trigger is some potential ugly events. Okay. I'll talk about what ugly things can happen in a few more slides. So you package up your application, you've submitted to the agency. What happens when the FDA receives it? They put together a team of reviewers. You're going to have a regulatory project manager. You will already be familiar with this individual from long time ago when you made your request of your application number and such. But your regulatory project manager at FDA will shepherd the review process. You will have a project manager for quality. You'll have, of course, a medical reviewer, a clinical reviewer, your farm tox reviewer, your clin farm reviewer, your statistics reviewer. You have an integrated quality assessment. And then FDA has consultations with other offices as needed. And then ultimately you'll have supervisory sign-off. So many team members are now involved in reviewing your application behind the scenes. So here's part of that uglies that I've mentioned. When you submit your application, there is a filing period. It's 60 days, the filing review period. And by day 45, FDA will have had an internal meeting to discuss your application and decide if they are going to file your application. So submitting an application is when you send it to FDA. Filing of an application is when FDA accepts that application for review. And that happens within day 60. By day 74, you will get what we call a D74 letter, which is day 74 letter. And in it, FDA will tell you what their major issues or deficiencies are from a preliminary standpoint. So when they looked at that application by day 45, they have a good discussion amongst themselves. They decide to accept that application. And by day 74, you'll get a day 74 letter that tells you what your major deficiencies or issues might be. This is your clue as to what your team needs to gear up to defend or to respond to. there's a typo there, but the regulatory project manager will send you requests, and they will shepherd the behind the scenes activities at FDA. And I have a picture of that coming up. Okay, so what happens in your filing review if they decide not to accept your application and you get a refusal to file? So if they refuse to file, you have, as a sponsor, 30 days to have a discussion with the agency on what might have gone wrong, or maybe they've made a mistake. But if it truly is a refusal to file, you can request a refund of your filing fee. I showed you earlier that was at, I can't remember, 3 million something. You will get 75% of your filing fee, not the 100%. So it's quite expensive just to get a refusal to file. And why do you get a refusal to file? Well, basically, if during that first 45 days when they're reviewing your application, when they decide that it is incomplete and they cannot do a substantial review, there's a few other items in there on what will trigger a refusal to file. Okay, so assuming they've filed your application, you're going to have to submit a 120-day safety update. So when you were compiling your application, you had a data lock point, and you've already submitted your application, and there's typically some data still coming in, especially follow-up from safety if there were adverse events and such. So you're going to provide a 120-day safety update. They're also going to be looking at your proprietary name, your trade name. Even if you had submitted that previously, a long, long time ago during your IND, they will review it now again because your application is now getting ready to be approved. Well, it's in review, and the assumption is hopefully it will get approved. It will also trigger pre-approval inspections, both from a GCP, good clinical practice standpoint, as well as a GMP, good manufacturing standpoint. And FDA will go out to conduct site audits of your clinical trial sites. They may conduct a sponsor audit, and then, of course, they will do a quality audit of your manufacturing facilities. And then while your application is in review, you will get information requests. So I mentioned this earlier when we talked about the IND being submitted. You get questions or requests, clarifications. The same thing happens with your application. Information requests come at any time point after your submission. So be ready. They will again tell you when they want their responses back, a day, 2 days, sometimes within a few hours. It just depends on what they're asking for, but they want it back, and you have to comply as the sponsor. So again, not to forget, information requests, they're coming. So you have to prepare and respond. Your product might have an advisory committee meeting. You may have phase 4 commitments, and for sure you'll have labeling review and labeling negotiations. All of this will be happening during your review of your application. And then at the end of your review, 3 things could happen. You will get a complete response. If you get a complete response, which is a nice way of saying you're not approved, it will detail why or what your deficiencies are and what you need to do to make them, to correct them. Then you're going to have to resubmit your application, either as a class 1 or a class 2, and that's how you fix your application when it gets a complete response. You could have a tentative approval, and which means you'll have some conditions set forth upon that approval, and typically it shows up in a risk evaluation mitigation strategy. Usually there's something wrong, not wrong, but something triggering some additional safety concerns. This is not very often used. The FDA would prefer to just give you a complete response than to give you a tentative approval. And then the good news is you'll have a full approval. So basically you get a complete response, which is not approved, with a list of deficiencies that you will need to correct, or you'll get an approval. Okay, this is my very last slide. And this is a picture of everything that I've just mentioned in terms of what's going on in the review. So if you look at item number 1, it's the pre-submission activities. That's your pre-application, pre-submission meeting and discussions. And then you're going to submit your application. That's day 0. If you look along the top, the red text is for priority review. So priority review, I mentioned that during our designations slide, it compresses the review time. A typical FDA standard review is 10 months. A priority review is 6 months. So you get 4 months back, or it expedites your review time, FDA review time by 4 months. The review time is 10 standard months. 10 months is standard review. However, your calendar time is 12 months. And why is that? Because I mentioned to you there's a 60-day filing period. So you submit on day 0, but it gets filed on day 60. And when you have a 10-month review time, in calendar time, it's 12 months, and that's depicted for you in the bottom of your slide here. Where's my mouse? There it is. See this? This is your calendar months, and here's your review months. So it's a 10-month standard review. And your priority review is 6 months, and it's up here, right here. Everything gets compressed. So basically, you have an application submitted. They do a review, a filing review. They're doing their review planning. This is what FDA is working on. Here's your 45-day planning review meeting. Day 60 is when they file it, and then they start all of their review. Somewhere around month 5, FDA has a mid-cycle meeting, middle of the review meeting. This is another touch point of when you're going to see a very large bolus of information requests. Information requests start at any time, meaning way over here. By day 1, your information requests can start. But typically, they start to get generated between day 60 and your mid-cycle review. You'll get a large amount at your mid-cycle because they're halfway through and they have to finish up. Then over here by month 8, calendar time month 8 or review time month 6, they're pretty much wrapping up and finishing up. This is when all your prior approval inspections are happening or being scheduled to happen, and then they'll wrap up. And right here, this is where they wrap up, and they're getting ready to take their official action, which is complete response, approval, a tentative approval, or a full approval. And then you get your action date, which is your completion of your review. Standard is 10 months, priority is 6 months. You get your letter, and then you move on to your post-approval activities, if any. And that's it. And I will take questions.
네, 지금까지 샌디서 박사님의 발표 잘 들어봤습니다. 긴 시간 동안에 굉장히 상세하게 발표를 해주셔서 유익한 발표가 되었는데요. 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 자, 그러면 지금 남은 시간을 이용해서 저희가 질문을 받아볼 텐데 먼저 현장에 계신 분들 중에서 질문이 있으시면 손을 들어주시면 저희가 마이크 가져다 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 저쪽에 먼저 한번 드리겠습니다. 영어로
May I speak in English?
편하게 하셔도 됩니다.
Yes, in whatever language.
Good morning and good evening for you, Dr. Saw. First of all, thank you for your presentation, giving a step-by-step process of IND and the NDA application process. And I believe I can speak on behalf of many majority Korean pharma companies that it is almost inevitable not to use data collected from clinical trials that were conducted here in Korea for FDA application. And though we can easily find IND regulations on FDA website, as you mentioned, they're somewhat broad and open. So, for example, when using OUS data in the US, it is mentioned that the data should be generalizable and applicable to US population, including patient demographics, differences in medical practices. But demographic itself has so many criteria, including race, sex, ethnicity, and etc. So my question is, what are some key demographic factors that we have to capture when we collect data from clinical trials here in Korea? And second, any advice, actually your advice on how to maximize our OUS data, which will be utilized for our FDA submission?
Understood. So in terms of collection, you're going to collect typical demographic information, sex, weight, height, etc. In Korea, because the population is, I'm going to say like 99% Koreans, I think I know there are like white people, black people, Hispanic people, and other people that do live in Korea now. But today, the society is very much, quote, Korean. So you're going to collect that. And I don't know who participated in trials, but my guess is they'll be Koreans. So you're going to collect normal demographics. You have to then translate what that means to the American population. In the US, there's only maybe 10% Asians, and of that 10%, even the Asians, we're talking Chinese, Thai, Vietnamese, like a whole mix of Asians. It's not limited to, quote, Koreans. You might say Koreans, Japanese, Chinese might be more similar in the East Asian, but anyways, that is a very tiny percentage of the American population. But it doesn't matter, because what if that regulation, what that's intended to do is for you to explain why, even though you're using Koreans as your test subjects, how does that translate to the broader American population? Key differences, I'm going very top level key differences. Height and weight is a major difference. The typical BMI in an American is very large. We're talking 25, 30 is a very normal BMI here. That's considered normal. Our range of obesity is very high compared to a typical Korean or Asian population. However, and then the other thing that we have a high percentage here that, of course, you don't have is Caucasians and Blacks, which is very limited there. However, it doesn't matter, because it depends on the disease state that you are testing. So I don't know, I'm not a clinician, but if diabetes is the same in Koreans as it is in Americans, aka whites and blacks with bigger BMI and so forth, then even though your population is Korean and not American, you can still make that argument if that's a true case. So I don't know what your indication is, but your disease state has to be reflected or translatable to the American population. I hope that makes sense. And if it's not, then it's highly probable when you bring your development program here to the US, FDA is going to force you to conduct what I'll call a repeat clinical trial, so that your results can then be, mimicked even in the American population. So applications here, FDA will accept applications with 0 US American patients. You can conduct your clinical trials 100% outside of the US. That does not preclude an application. However, if you conduct whatever you're conducting, whatever disease state, if it's not reflective of the American population, it's very highly probable they will make you conduct one. I hope that helps.
네, 답변 되었기를 바라겠습니다. 다음 분 혹시 질문 있으실까요? 현장에서 질문 먼저 받도록 하겠습니다. 네.
Thank you for nice lecture. We are preparing Pre-Ind Meeting with 2 drug fixed dose combination. One drug is OTC drug, and one drug is a kind of vitamin. Because 2 drugs have been used for a long time, about 40 years, in USA without any safety issues. So we apply using 505(b)2 regulatory pathway. but because two drugs have been approved about 40 years ago, so it is hard to find appropriate references about safety and mechanisms. So in the case, may I apply, and in addition, this drug is combination drug. In the case, is it possible to apply using 505(b)(2) regulatory pathway? And do we have to conduct more additional safety experiments? Yeah, that's all.
Mm-hmm. So yes, 505(b)(2), not a problem. Today, I didn't talk about combination drugs or combination devices, drug-device combos. They are all within the pathway. Today's was very simplistic, so it was just a single molecule. But you said you have two drugs. Both have been approved and safe for 40-ish years. But the second drug is a vitamin.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Vitamins are categorized completely different by the FDA. Vitamins are not, quote, drugs. They're not developed as drugs. So a vitamin A, for example, vitamin D, it doesn't matter what vitamin, they are consumed and available, but they are not drugs from FDA's drug regulatory pathway. However, FDA does have quirks. FDA has some uniqueness. So there are, off the top of my head, 4 or 5 combination products, drug, vitamin, combination drugs that have been approved. And so there is a pathway for that. But typically speaking, when you try to add a vitamin as a drug, you will have to develop the vitamin as a drug, which means you will have to do a full set of pre-clin development. Let me back up. You may need to do a full pre-clin development. It just depends on the vitamin, what kind of vitamin, how it acts, and how much data is available. But you're going to have a harder time than you imagine, because I know sitting where you're sitting, you understand it's a product, vitamin, that's available on the shelf. People, hundreds of people, thousands of millions of people have been taking it for decades, so it is safe. But you don't have any efficacy to that. So when you go to the FDA, I'm going to predict for you, your program is going to be a lot more expensive, and you're missing a lot of tests that you don't believe is necessary. But because it's a vitamin and you want to use it as a drug, you're changing the categorization of that. It's going to come out a lot more difficult than you expect, sadly. But there are drug vitamin combos that have already been approved. There's about 4 or 5 of them. But they are very unique and very, I'll call them rare. So yes, you can pursue a 505(b)(2). There is plenty of data. You're going to use a lot of historic publications. But I suspect you're going to be facing dosage issues. FDA is going to ask you, how do you know what dosage it is? Vitamins come in arbitrary numbers. There's no dose ranging studies that have ever been conducted. So I suspect you're going to be tasked with dosing. That's going to be a hardship for you. And you'll be tasked with efficacy. That's a hardship for you. That's my best guess, because vitamins don't have hard endpoints that have been demonstrated. They use them for that reason, but they haven't been demonstrated. Right? Vitamin D is good for your bones. They haven't conducted studies for that. So anyway, so yes, 505(b)(2), yes, literature. It's okay to have a combination, but vitamins are very difficult to push through. So good luck. I'll watch out for you.
네, 감사합니다. 현장에서 혹시
Thank
또
you.
다른 질문이 있으실까요?
Any other questions from the floor, from the room here?
네, 없으시다면 저희가
If
온라인상으로
not, we're
또
going
받은
to
질문이
move on to
있어서
some
제가
questions we
먼저
have
읽어드리도록
collected
하겠습니다.
online. Let me read them out for
Parental Injectable 제형의
Parental
NC를 가지고
Injectable NC,
1상,
you use
2상
that and
IND를
based on the
서포트하기
phase
위한
2
스테빌리티 연구를
to
진행
support that, we're
중입니다.
conducting stability
Storage Position, 그
testing
오리엔테이션에
now.
대한
Storage
연구를
position,
함께
orientation
진행
study
중이고요.
is also being done
Primary
simultaneously.
batch로
And
Upright,
using primary
Invert,
batch, upright,
Horizon
invert,
연구를
horizon
진행해서
studies have
Worst
been done.
Case를 확인하고
confirm the
추후
worst case.
Storage Position에 대한 연구는 재진행하지 않고자 합니다. 다만 해당 배치가 Primary batch보다 작은 Small Scale batch입니다. FDA에서는 Primary batch에서 진행된 연구만 인정하는지요? 라고 질문을 주셨습니다.
That's my question.
So I am going to push your question to Dr. Park, Dr. Ka-young Park. She's coming on a little bit later, but she can address that. You want to have a focused CMC response, and she'll respond to that.
네, 그러면 저희가 패널 토론 시간을 활용을 해서 질문을 박가영 박사님께 또 다시 한번 드리도록 하겠습니다. 저희가 시간이 많이 지났는데요. 잠시 저희는 휴식 시간을 가지고 또 남은 질문들도 패널 토론 때 더 연결을 해서 많이 드리도록 하겠습니다. 11시 10분, 한국 시간으로 11시 10분에 다시 뵙도록 하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.